Good day to everyone. Welcome and thank you for attending the book launch of Bodies and Knowledge, Children and Childhoods in Health and Affliction. My name is Michelle and I'm a publisher at Affliction Media. The publishing house was established in 2004 and we specialize in academic and scholarly publishing. We feel very honored to be a part of this publication and we feel it greatly contributes to its field of knowledge. It's been a true pleasure to work with the editors, to work with their content, and we hope that this is the start of many more to come. So we are going to ask that if you would like to ask a question or if you would like to interact with the speakers, please raise your hand or post a question in the Q&A section or in the chat. The contributors of the book will now start by speaking about the respective chapters. We hope you enjoy this discussion. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be in the space, to be launching this book with you all. It's been such a long journey. My name is Efwa Pra. I'm one of the editors on the book, along with Professor Susan Levine. This is our launch. Hey! And we have some of the contributing authors here, as well as Professor Ria Reis and Dr. Michelle Pentecost. So I'll be just doing a short introduction to sort of usher us into the feel of the book, and then we can get into the thick of talking about the themes, talking about children, talking about childhoods, and the import of the work that all of the contributors have done. So with us today, we have Professor Ria Reis. And she's a medical anthropologist currently affiliated with the Amsterdam Institute for Global Health and Development in the Netherlands. And also she's an honorary professor at the Children's Institute, which is based at the University of Cape Town. She's also an emeritus professor at Leiden University Medical Center and the University of Amsterdam. It's such a pleasure and such a great honor, and I'm so forever grateful that you've made the time, Ria, to be a discussant. I met Ria a very long time ago when I was just beginning my PhD study. So really, this is such a great honor to have you as part of what that research embodied. And so basically this is the tail end. So thank you so much, Ria, for being the discussant here. I'm looking forward to the generative discussions that will follow. We also have Dr. Michelle Pentecost, who is based at the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine at King's College London. She is a physician anthropologist, which, you know, within the medical humanities and within medical anthropology, it's such a rare skill set. It's a absolute, I think that the discussion will be so much more fruitful and enlivened by the experience as a physician, as well as her experience as a medical anthropologist. She's an honorary researcher also at the School of Clinical Medicine at the University of the Witwatersrand. And she's an honorary affiliate of the First 1,000 Days Research Group, which is based at the University of Cape Town, or alongside Professor Fiona Ross. Her current research in South Africa investigates the social and ethical implications of public health interventions. This tracks the period between early childhood, and what's happening there is that there's an innovative qualitative methodology that's emerging. So fantastic to have you there, to have you here, sorry, rather. And Michelle will be facilitating the Q&A with the wider audience, which is happening a bit later. Then, of course, with us, we also have the 4 contributors. Of the 8 contributions that the edited volume makes, we have Mutsawashe Mutendi with us, and we have Rosemary Blake, and we have Stephen Pence and Alicia Ernston, and each of them will be sharing a little bit after what I've presented here, sharing a little bit about their chapters. And then, of course, there's me, and then Susan Levine, and we'll also be sharing a little something about the contributions that we've made to this beautiful book, Bodies of Knowledge, of which I'm so thrilled to be holding, to feel it, and to see all of the contributions there, because it's really such a it's such a joy to have a book of this nature that combines art and critical thinking around children and childhoods, or just generally around research. So with that, I would like to extend the welcome to Mutsawasha to share a little bit about the contributing chapter that she shared with the book with you all.
Good morning, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be in the space and to be also given this opportunity to contribute to this body of knowledge. So first of all, I'm a PhD student at UCT, and I'm primarily interested in mining and health, reproductive health. And this is how I came to write this chapter, which is based off my master's research. And basically, this chapter kind of thinks through childhood starting in the womb, which is something that hasn't been done too often. So it interrogates childhood from the womb. And basically, this chapter is based on the experiences of female mine workers, and it looks at their experiences of pregnancy and how mining policies play a part in shaping women's experiences of pregnancy, and thus in turn also impacting the health of a fetus. So in short, the chapter looks at female mine workers in the platinum industry. And one of the observations that I made was that pregnant women were working underground whilst pregnant. Mining policy does stipulate that it is harmful for pregnant women to work underground because of the various gases and toxic poisoning that can happen to the baby. So as a part of their mining policies, they stipulate that if you are pregnant, you need to report your pregnancy to HR, and an alternative job will be found for you on the surface. But what happens in mining companies is that sometimes the number of pregnant women exceed the number of alternative jobs on the surface. And this places women in a very precarious situation, because if you report your pregnancy in the first trimester and there are no alternative jobs on the surface, the mining company will send you home. They'll be like, okay, we'll still pay you your mandatory maternity leave, but sometimes you find that women have like perhaps 3 or 4 months where they don't have a pay and their maternity leave hasn't paid in. So to avoid this economic precarity, women conceal their pregnancies and they work underground in spaces that are harmful for their baby. So these mining policies are meant to ensure their well-being, but end up putting them in in an economic situation. And so it's that tension, how policies can materialize as violence, and how then female mine workers are also, as a form of care, conceal their pregnancy and work underground, which is also, it's a double-edged sword, because that's also very dangerous for the baby, but that is the only way that they see how they can provide a livelihood for their child, and it's also thinking through how an infant's health is also kind of predetermined by the mom's social, political, economic standing. So yes, that is my chapter in a long-winded nutshell.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Mutawashe. I'm going to now ask perhaps Stephen Pence just to discuss some of the rising themes or whatever he'd like to share about his contribution.
Yes, hi, good morning, everyone. And a quick shout out to Efwa, Susan, and my fellow contributors. Thanks so much for having me today. My name is Stephen. I'm currently a lecturer in the Department of Family Medicine at Wits University. And I'm teaching a course in health systems and more recently working with colleagues to develop medical humanities in our faculty. So we're very excited about that. My chapter is also based on my master's research, which feels like many years ago. And it was really about, initially the work was about young people's experiences, discussions, and use of traditional African medicine and healing practices. But what I came to learn as a student in the field was that young people were talking more about their everyday challenges, the precarity surrounding their lives. And out of this, their discussions around traditional medicine was almost, a sidelined sort of response. But I did discover something very interesting towards the end of my field work, was when people were talking about this use of Amakosi spirits and how they use this means of, in a sense, a possession cult to help them to deal with a number of challenges that they were experiencing in their families and in their school lives. I think one of the first things that really strikes me when I reread this work and think about the young people I worked with is that because it was more than 10 years ago, these young people are now young adults and are likely to have children themselves. And I also wonder in what ways many of the challenges that they spoke about are present in their lives and perhaps in the lives of their children still. I guess my work now in medical education, which is trying to take more seriously the calls for increased access to higher education, and that might result in tangible opportunities for people, kind of resonates still. And that's, students that we are working with often today talk about these similar sorts of challenges that I was unpacking with these young people. And I feel there's always relevance to reflect on these challenges in young people's lives today. So I'm going to leave it at that, I think. Thanks, Efwa.
Thank you so much, Stephen. And now we'll hear from Alicia Ensign about her contributing chapter.
Thank you, Farah. Good morning, everyone. This is so exciting. I would like to start by saying a big thank you to the editors and publishers for allowing me the privilege of being part of such an important body of literature. It is truly something special. And it's also quite an honor to be amongst this caliber of author and discussant. The fieldwork for my chapter took place during my honors year. I suppose that we've all been there, where you have to ask yourself, what is the theme of my research going to be? And then once you've ascertained what it is going to be and what you'd like to focus on, you've presented, you've had it ethically approved, and then suddenly you encounter all of this red tape, to protect our potential participants, of course. But then you start questioning, will this actually end up happening at all? And I am so grateful that I was able to do the fieldwork that I set out to. The first 3 words of my chapter title, Living with Mortality, only scraped the surface of the world that I encountered. Every parent who shared their story with me had a similar entry into that world, in that they were going about their everyday lives when their child presented with an ailment that led them to a cancer diagnosis. There was no forewarning, and regardless of background, lifestyle, living circumstances, anything, they were catapulted into that space. The rest of the chapter title, How Beliefs and Routine Are Experienced in a Pediatric Oncology Ward, sum up exactly what the chapter is. It's a tale of experiences, encounters, conversations, and beliefs that take place in a space that pulls you away from whatever it is that you were doing and force you to face an unexpected reality. So my hope is that this chapter provides insights into a space that many have not been in and hopefully never will need to be in, and that it piques interest as to how those in that space may be further assisted. I have heard various adverts for fundraising for CHOC, who I mentioned in the chapter, on the radio and on social media quite a few times since my fieldwork took place. And it always makes me smile because they do something absolutely amazing, and it is often only recognized when there's a need. So essentially, there is a tiny parallel universe within the walls of the hospitals and of CHOC lodges. And I hope that my chapter brings those not in that space that much closer to it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alicia, for that reflection on what your chapter contributes to the wider discussion around children and childhoods in health and also in affliction. I'm going to draw on Susan just to discuss a little bit about her chapter that she actually wrote in with you know what, Susan, you got this.
Thank you, Effa. I actually have a tear in my eye just seeing students work in the honors year, Alicia and Stephen and Mutsa, work from postgraduate students is formative research. Students co-produce knowledge with their supervisors, mentors, lecturers, and I just wanted to say thank you to African Sun Media for taking a chance on publishing in a book form the work of young scholars who are now very much in professional roles. And it signals, I think, a game-changing shift, to use Fiona Ross said. This book is a game changer in a message that she wrote. And I just wanted to say, I think it is absolutely critical that this co-collaboration of knowledge production is recognized. So huge thank you. Thank you to Efwa Pra, you've been the champion of this book and made this a reality. And it's just been a really absolute pleasure working with you for so many years. We're now at the closing end. And also just wanted to say thank you to the National Research Foundation, who was behind the initial funding for students to do their degrees at UCT. And I'm so delighted that the books come into being. Also to Nina Callahan for reading the book, was the first reader and giving such extraordinary feedback and warm reception. So just in a nutshell, I co-authored a chapter of the book with colleagues Alison Schwartz, who I'm not sure if Ali's here, but hello, Alison, who's currently a lecturer, and we'll say more about Alison shortly, and also Professor Andrea Rother, who is Professor of Public Health here at UCT. Alison's joining us from the UK. And the chapter is a part of an ongoing project that began just before 2008, in which we recognized a spike in childhood poisonings at the Red Cross Children's Hospital here in Mowbray in Cape Town. And we're trying to understand, within the School of Public Health, was trying to put together a kind of etiology of childhood poisonings. And we're able to link it back to a very complex interface between an abject environmental space of a lack of service delivery, lack of proper water sanitation in poor township areas throughout the Western Cape, areas that have been completely politicized in the sense of somehow not being on the register of what kinds of spaces are worthy of proper service delivery. And so what the chapter does is to look beyond the surface of demands for better service delivery in terms of water sanitation, and to look at the everyday physical manifestations in children's lives that are impacted by a lack of services and a lack of regard. And the dehumanizing spaces which give rise to childhood poisonings. And in a nutshell, essentially that nexus is a proliferation of rats that live in these areas, coupled with a poor housing infrastructure in which the rats enter households, the desire to care for children who live in those houses and to prevent bites from rats, which cause multiple forms of infectious disease, including plague and listeriosis and others. And then the use of rodenticides, largely illegal rodenticides, which have been siphoned off of agricultural farms, aldicarb and other organophosphates. Those poisons are then mixed with porridge and other food put on the floor for rats to eat as a way to control the rat populations. And what happens is that children very accidentally eat these, ingest the poisons alongside the rats and end up in miserable conditions in terms of internal poisoning. And so, unlike some of the other chapters, the chapter rather, we haven't managed to create a context in which the children in these spaces on the gurneys in the hospital are able to speak. In fact, they're rendered quite voiceless. And that's one of the challenges moving forward with the work is to really interrogate the question of childhood poisoning from the perspective of children. So it is a theoretical analysis of, and the political economy, drawing on Achille Mbembe's theoretical framing of waste to understand the different complex ways in which childhoods are bound up with toxic environments. So that's just a tiny taste, an entry point of the chapter. It's an ongoing project which began in 2008 and is still ongoing. And so this particular chapter marks a really important moment in the bringing together of an interdisciplinary project that brings together public health, anthropology, and fine arts. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Susan. I'm just going to check in with Rosemary Blake. And just maybe, Rose, if you can hear us, if you'd like to share a little bit about what your chapter contributes to the wider volume.
Sure, Efwa, and I can hear you. Sorry, I'm coming in through my phone, so it can't quite handle doing the video. Yeah, and also just to begin by thanking you, Efwa and Susan, for seeing us through the finish line for this efforts. Yeah, you have been tireless, and really, really grateful for this opportunity to have been part of this. So thank you for that. Yeah, my research, you know, it was conducted many years ago, and Susan, it's touching for me as well to remember who I was when I did that. And in some ways, I feel like I was a child back then, and I reread it, you know, obviously when we were preparing the drafts, but that was also a while ago. So I reread it just last Friday, and remembering that amazing time of really being in the field for the very first time, and what that meant to me. And, you know, the chapter itself, just for those who don't know, takes place also in oncology ward at a children's hospital. And I followed about 3 children, but there were more, but primarily 3 children, while they did a block of chemotherapy treatment at the hospital. And in the chapter, I think about and reflect a lot on children and childhood and the way that they've been treated within the social sciences and anthropology. And then I also spend a lot of time thinking about the children's experience of illness and the assumptions that I went in that were framed a lot by Arthur Kleiman's illness narratives, and how the children really challenged me on those assumptions and got me to a place of understanding a far more embodied and kind of immediate experience of what it meant to be sick, and what it didn't mean to be sick, maybe more importantly. Yeah, so that's what I hope the chapter contributes. It is, I think, and, you know, maybe for me, because I experienced it as well being there, but I feel it's quite a vivid account that really can take you there and help to understand a little bit about what it's like to be a child going through something like that within a hospital environment. Yeah, and I think that's all I have to say.
Thank you so much, Rose. And yes, so I'm going to just continue on from where Rose has left it. There's 2 things that I want to alert everyone to, and I'm going to be using the book there. I hope everyone can see that. You'll see here there's a QR code, and the QR code takes you to a link to a film that my film partner and I, Kim Keating, we made called Where COVID Lies. And it really came quite late in the stage, of course, because COVID has been happening for the past 3 years globally. So this is possibly the latest, well, along with one other chapter, but this is one of the latest, more sort of artistic contributions. So what you need to do is just click on the QR code and it'll take you to the film called Where COVID Lies. And it's just a short 3-minute account of children's experiences of living with COVID. A lot of the narrative surrounded children's experiences of not going to school, which was interesting. So that's, that would take a research question to another level, looking at education and the impact of that pedagogical structures have had on children's worlds and children's lives. But it was really exciting. I also have a film production company, and we enjoy making films around environmental justice, social justice issues. And so this I love this film. It was so beautifully edited by Kim Keating. So I encourage you all to have a look at that, which also signals what this book represents. It's a real beautiful harmony of different art drives. So we have a plate from Ali Ahmed. We also have a contribution from Gatlejo Tlabela, who's a fine artist. We have a fantastic short story at the end of the book, which I really, really loved. But more specifically to the chapter that I contribute, it's about internally displaced populations, specifically children, in Symphony Way temporary location area. Of course, it's part of my what was my doctoral thesis, and it makes also part of the monograph that's in the pipelines. But the specific chapter looks at the ways in which violence impacts children, and how children begin to articulate and build a vocabulary of meaning around violence. So it looks at, or tries to theorize around space and violence, the urban scape. And also I try and begin a discussion around internally displaced populations, because it's something that within the literature in South Africa and within sort of state policy around housing and around migration, we don't really talk about internally displaced populations. The populations in South Africa are not regarded as such. But if we have this category of analysis, it really allows for a much more nuanced and a much more meaningful discussion around some of the challenges that people are facing based on current forced removal. So we're not even talking about during apartheid, which people frown upon. We have forced removals that are happening right now. But this is largely left out of the media, and especially when it involves children, this is very much not something that we talk about. So that's what the chapter hopefully it attempts to do. That it attempts to bring into conversation the life worlds and the life experiences of children having to navigate these very difficult terrains of movement and of internal displacement. And also it brings into conversation the relationships between foreign African nationals, which is another titling which I have problems with, but foreign African nationals, children, refugee children, and how within that population, these, the types of relationships that are forged is brought to light in that chapter. So that's some of the work that we've all shared. I'm so thrilled. I love the idea that also that it's a very it reflects the work that students were doing that have finally come into fruition. And it's really lovely to see where everybody is right now, all those years after what we contributed through the generosity of Susan and the grant and the NRF. It was a wonderful experience. So I'm going to hand over to Professor Ria Reis to just reflect a little bit more about the book and share her thoughts around some of the chapters. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Afua all. Let me first say this is an extraordinary collection of chapters and works of art and poetry that together present a multifaceted picture, bouquet as the editors call it in the introduction, of childhood and children's and youth embodied experiences of disease and healing under conditions of structural violence and historical trauma. We read in Rose's chapter about how children in an oncology ward where mothers cannot always be present react to touch and help the field worker to understand the emotional dimension of knowing. And in another oncology ward, how children with their caretakers, their mothers, in unexpected realities, as Alicia calls it, learn about death and prospective grieving. Yet in another TB ward, the making of culture, when children navigating the choreography of biomedical procedures develop rituals and conceptualizations of labor. Outside of the wards in Afua's work, we read about how children share with the ethnographer their learned experiences of who, what, and where was safe in a deprived and unsafe environment. Or in Susan's work, how where living circumstances seem to render humans as waste, mothers try to protect their children against the filth and rodents by using poisons disguised as water. And how, as Mutta Washe explained, expecting mothers in the mining industry prevent the dangers of being sent home to die, which would lead to them not being able to care for their children in future, but thereby expose their child to dangers related to mining. How an NGO's care for orphans in Eswatini creates disruptions in the social fabric. And by growing children in God's way, dislocates them from the Swazi self. And how in Stefan's chapter, youth in fragmentized and deprived circumstances that prevent them from being initiated into manhood enlist the spirits of ancestors, contested spirits, as sources of power, coping, and respectability. These are incredibly rich accounts of how children, youth, and their caregivers navigate volatile environments and choiceless choices, structural deprivation, and violence. And in between and overarched are poems and works of arts and a short story that speak to other layers of our senses, whereby we can come closer to worlds of children, sometimes further explained, sometimes speaking for itself. Now, thinking of my experience reading this collection, and now also hearing a selection of the pieces presented, I'm really amazed how the editors and the group have been able to firmly ground the work in the current debates at work in the overarching anthropological discipline, particularly medical anthropology, critical anthropology, the anthropology of children and childhood. And on the other hand, they have been able to avoid presenting one dominant theoretical discourse on children and childhood. So if the authors aim to raise the reader's curiosity while engaging them with different theoretical contexts, they have certainly succeeded. This lively creation is what I sometimes see happening in successful interactive classrooms, and I really congratulate you with bringing this creativity outside of the classroom for our inspiration. I have a few questions that emerged while reading the book. And the first is related to something that struck me while reading the narratives on the wards. These descriptions and representations are not unlike ethnographical reports on children in wards in, say, Europe. And I'm reminded of Bloom and Langner's seminal first hospital ethnography that is also cited in the book. But what does that say about the comparison between childhoods in different worlds? And what does it say about how culture is unmade and remade in such settings, and children's active engagements with this process? What it is to be a child in such a ward. The question is, in what way is that different from how culture is being made and remade by adult patients on a ward? So what is specific regarding children and childhood here in regards to different child worlds, but also in regards to adult worlds? And I know it's a big question, but it's what is being raised, I think, very pointedly by the book. And secondly, somewhere on the way through the book, I started to realize that the combination of anthropological essays, of artwork, stories, and references to music in some of these works and in the poems, that made me, that inspired me to look at Spotify and listen to what inspired the artist. This assemblage somehow, indeed, how can I say, crept under my skin, made me feel coming closer to the subjectivities represented here. And as an example, I read Tony Stewart's heartbreaking Spiegel im Spiegel, found it beautiful, and then read the story of children and mothers' prospective grieving in the oncology ward. Then I looked at Spotify, returned to the music of devotion that inspired Tony's poem, and then reread the poem again and was amazed to feel my skin crawl with gooseflesh at the right moment that the poem described it. So now I wonder, and I'm not sure if you can comment on that, I wonder how written representations, art, poetry, music, they are often presented as if they are parallel processes. But how they talk to one another needs to be explained. And in this assemblage, and I think it truly is a game changer, and also I think a very important work to think further on, in this assemblage, the reader is exposed in a step-by-step process to different forms. And it's also in the building of this process that knowledge becomes embodied by the reader. And I wonder if you, or perhaps one of the artists or poets, if they are in the audience could comment on this. But my compliments and congratulations on this beautiful collection. Thank you.
Thank you, Ria.
Thank you so much, Ria, for such a generous reading of the text. I do want to welcome Dr. Michelle Pentecost, perhaps to facilitate. I've noted the questions, Ria, and so I'd like to invite Dr. Michelle Pentecost to guide us from here toward the end of the launch. Just around the questions that might be arising. I have tabled them. Thank you so much. They're fantastic questions, and I think I will, either Susan and I or one of the other contributors will address it. Over to you, Michelle.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the invitation to join and to be a part of this celebration of such an amazing and innovative volume. I can only agree with what's already been said about this being a game changer, specifically around what Ria has just described in terms of the assemblage of different forms in the book, as well as what people have already mentioned around the community of young scholars that is represented in this book, which is really amazing to see, and congrats to all of you. So I have a few questions of my own, but I'd like to invite the audience to either put your question in the Q&A or to raise your hand if you would like to contribute to the discussion. We'll keep Ria's questions in the back of our minds as well as we ongo with our conversations, so that the contributors can respond to those very broad but very important questions that she's raised. While we're waiting for the audience to perhaps ask a few questions, I think I'll say a few words and ask a question myself. I think there's a phrase in the introduction which really captures what this volume has done, which is that it embodies an ethics of care and creativity. And I think it's really evident throughout all the contributions, the level of care that has been extended in the way that this ethnographic and artistic work has been done. I think also very important to reiterate again how exceptional this volume is in what it is representing in childhoods in Africa. Beyond what we know in our established canon of work in this area, where we know that specific illnesses, for example, have received a lot of attention. And in this volume, we see cancer, we see TB, we see environmental exposure as a really important new avenue of exploration that has been so well attended to. As a kind of opening question, I think what has been alluded to so well in the introduction is this tension or difficulty of, on the one hand, expanding an anthropology or a sociology of childhood, while at the same time not kind of re-siloing the child as a category of other. So I wondered if any one of the contributors or the editors wanted to speak a little bit about how you've managed that tension so well to integrate these anthropologies of childhood rather than kind of re-siloing. And of course, if you want to respond to Ria's questions in your response, that's also great.
These are all such great questions. Are any of the contributors want to perhaps speak to any of the questions that have been put forward? We can also treat it, as sort of not informal, but as a discussion. Let's leave it free flowing, so we don't have to stick to a very strict formal presentation. So Rose, Alicia, Stephen, Susan, if you want to jump in, let's have it as a discussion. Rather, perhaps maybe let me begin. So Michelle, just to address your question, I think that how does one escape creating reified or essentialized categories, or rather like not presenting a positivist framework on how we understand children and childhood? How do we maintain the fluidity of not categorizing, but yet at the same time acknowledging and honoring that it is a very particular moment in the making of personhood, which has no beginning and has no end. I think we're constantly in a process of becoming, constantly in a process of making persons, making ourselves persons. So, I think perhaps maybe the way in which we've sort of tried to dismantle those boundaries is by the inclusion of more artistic references of children and childhood, to approach the subject of children and childhoods from multiple angles, so that when, for example, in the interview with Katlego, then, he's talking very specifically, very subjectively about his experience of childhood and how that rendering of childhood makes manifest in his artwork. And I think it's also with the absence of more, social scientific jargon that, academics tend to fall under. When you extend the language format to other disciplines, you find that those reified categories slowly start melting away and people start finding different ways of talking about whatever it is that they're talking about. In this instance, it's children and childhoods. Another example would be as Ria mentioned, in Tony Stewart's contribution, the poetry there. I recently finished reading a beautiful other book where the author had inserted poetry inside the story that she was telling, and it's just, poetry takes you to a different different, playing field, a different landscape. And so when she reads childhood and childhood experiences through that, there's just a meaning that's created that is so personal and so private. And I think that's also where the dismantling of these reified categories can happen, is because we then we internalize what this poet has shared with us so earnestly and so in such a raw format, and we take that meaning and mold it into something that makes sense for us. So I think that's how those categories, at least within the anthropology of childhood, that's also part of why I love the discipline of anthropology, is that we get to dismantle and remake and dismantle constantly. We're in this process of turning the looking glass on our own discipline, on us, on the areas of study that we like to involve ourselves in. Yeah, so that's just a little bit about that. If anybody else wants to come in.
I think absolutely, Efwa, you've captured something about this volume. The words mercurial and slippery are both applied to the category of childhood throughout the book. And I think the book does an exceptional job of dealing with this kind of slippery nature of the concept of childhood, all the way through from Mutsuwache's in utero interrogations to adolescence and beyond, as you say, your contributors reflecting on their own childhoods in the volume. We have a hand from Alicia.
Yes, thank you. Just sort of in response to Prof. Ria Reis's questions regarding, Europe versus here, and what is specific regarding children and childhoods in these wards versus, if it was an adult with cancer, for example. So, I mean, of course, I can only really provide my own opinion in this regard. But I feel that the way in which everyday life is recreated in the ward differs greatly. So in terms of the Europe versus here aspect, I assume that whatever is normal for you is what is recreated in your wards here. But with regard to children versus adults, for children, it's like the whole family moves into the space, the school is recreated there, the parents are staying with them, everything, they try to recreate their life in that space. Whereas from what I've experienced with family and those sorts of things, where the adult has cancer, is while there is a support network, that idea of recreating that normalcy doesn't move to the ward, it stays at home. The focus is on the child. As Afua mentioned, so that making of personhood, basically. My understanding of it is that the focus is on making life as normal as possible for the child. So in response to your question, I guess I would say that the difference is that the focus remains on the children and maintaining normalcy in their childhood and helping them learn and grow and navigate. Yeah, I hope that makes sense.
I think also in the introduction to the volume and throughout the chapters, this resonance that Ria is describing between European and African contexts is a reflection of deep colonial histories that that structure the way that care is delivered in Southern Africa. And I think that's another strength of this volume, that it really situates itself in that history. Susan.
Thanks, Michelle. Thanks, Ria, for your question. I just wanted to think about your question around the parallel production of art and poetry on the one hand and the analytical essay on the other, and where those processes either meet or don't meet. And I think it's a critical question at this particular historical conjuncture with the birth of the health humanities, medical humanities, interdisciplinarity, the increased desire to break the silos, as you call them, to break the silos of, or Michelle, you mentioned the word silo, but to break down those silos of knowledge. And I think all too often we see the emergence of people wanting to break down the silos and then somehow reproducing them by staying in their own track. I'm the poet, I'm the filmmaker, I'm the storyteller, I'm the anthropologist. And in some sense, the conversations that that we had as editors happened very much behind the scenes, and we tried to bring it to the fore in the introduction. But moving forward, with our best foot forward, the question is central to the next step. And that is where those parallel processes can begin to conjoin with deeper reflection within the production of the knowledge. And so I think it's a really exciting question that each of us who ostensibly trying very hard to reach for that interdisciplinary affective space of learning across the zones of our own epistemologies and practices can lean into greater. So thank you for the question. And just as a tiny little caveat, the chapter that Alison and Andrea and I produced has grown into such a chapter that was published in the British Medical Journal, in which we invited an artist, Bertha Langeman, to join us and bring her artwork very much into the fold of our own academic and public health research. And that was absolutely changed the ways in which each of us as artists, as public health practitioner and anthropologists were able to think through the poisoning events of children and the impact on rats and the environment. And so something magical happens when you break down the parallel process and bring people into a space. So it's a wonderful question and a very timely question. So thank you for that. Thanks, Michelle.
I think your reflections there, Susan, they also capture something about the volume, and there are other ways in which it's doing that work. So for example, the use of radio workshops in Stephen's chapter as a methodology to allow children to express themselves in ways that are more amenable. And I think that is where the innovative methodological contribution here really lies, that one of the difficulties of anthropological work with children, as we know, is that the problem of pre-literacy and how we engage with children in ways that don't rely on ordinary language. And there's so many ways that this volume pushes the boundaries with that. So, that's another kind of example, I think. I don't see any questions at the moment from the audience. Any audience members, please do feel free. But while you are formulating your questions, I was also really struck, and I think Ria has also mentioned this, by the kind of autoethnographic and autobiographical components that appear in this volume. And I wondered if any of the contributors, perhaps Rosemary's definitely occurs in her chapter, would like to comment on how doing work with children invariably allows you to reflect on your own childhood and how that influences how this work has come about, and or if anyone else has any other reflections on that, how our own childhoods invariably present themselves as ethnographers of children.
I think one of the things, the story comes through in my chapter about losing my mother to cancer when I was, a teenager, but still kind of on that cusp of childhood. And so obviously that was playing a role consciously or unconsciously in me finding my place in that situation and working with children. But yeah, I think what's interesting for me is, like I said in my earlier reflection, is reading back on that research, which is now more than 10 years old, I think. Don't make me do maths in public. but seeing an aspect of the child in me, even in that research, and I suppose that's one of the things is, what are we actually using to define childhood and where that begins and where that ends? Because the older you get, the less certain it becomes where that really started or ended. And so perhaps those of us that work with children are investigating that for ourselves a little bit on the personal element.
Thanks, Rosemary.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, may I just quickly say something? I wanted to piggyback on Rose. In fact, I do want to mention that you know, the very early beginnings of the book itself as a manifestation of something that I actually wanted to work with Susan on was actually with Rosemary. We were sitting in a cafe somewhere, and we just pondered, you know, what had happened to the PhD and, you know, various contributions that we had made. So I just wanted to remind Rose that that's really, for me, where it started, was to imagine this in book format, to share what, you know, our peers were writing, and also to celebrate it, because it's a I guess it will always be a lifelong thing, is that my insistence on honoring the work that gets done in your early years of research, that it's such important work, and, you know, you throw yourself so wholeheartedly into it. And if I reflect upon my own doctoral experience, the chapter that I write about is from there. I was absolutely 100% in it. And when I read each of the chapters, I'm automatically, immediately transported into, it's such a visceral experience when I read Rosemary's chapter and she's sitting there with the young people, and they're talking about hair, and, you know, just the interactive way in which Rose presented the data. It was so, it was just such a beautiful rendering of the fieldwork experience. And, you know, I was right there sitting next to Rose. And that's really what I actually enjoy about the literature experience, is that it takes you, it transports you to a different world. So the moment that you open up the text, you know, you open up the book. I mean, I love reading, and I think Ria had mentioned this, I love a hard copy. It's not to knock off the online copies that are available, but as you open up a book and you're transported on the narratives that are shared, it's such a privilege, and it's such an honor to have that with us. And each of the chapters are like that. And also the last chapter, which is the short story, really does take you, it's a final send off, you know, where you just discard the theoretical framings and you immerse yourself in this little girl's world, and her experience of, I guess, you know, transformation for herself. So I'll leave it at that, because I think we also needing to wrap up, and there's just a few other things that I'd like to say.
We do have 2 questions now. People always wait until the last 5 minutes. So very quickly, Francis has asked, when does an adult bid a final farewell to childhood? Which is quite a provocative question. And then Stephen has asked, you know, in the context of COVID and the climate crisis, how does one translate crisis into the language and worlds of children? Is this a word or a concept that has any resonance for children and the researchers involved in these studies? So I don't know if anyone wants to offer a very quick response.
Yes, I can say something about the first question very briefly, because this is a question I use in my education, where every course on children and childhood, we ask it to the students where they felt, so from an emic perspective, when they felt they were no longer a child. And the variability is amazing. So if you have a Vietnamese young person who was, due to the war, sent as an 8-year-old to her aunt with younger siblings, she that may be the boundary of where she felt childhood stopped, because she now had to take care of her children, whereas a child or a young person from the West, from America or from Europe, may feel the menstruation is the boundary, or having a girlfriend. So the markers for becoming an adult from an emic perspective are very varied. But there's work on that, but we don't have time to go into that. Very fascinating question. And it says something about the fluidity of what it is when we look at emic perspectives. Thank you.
Okay, and we have Alison Swartz who can respond to Steve's question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Maybe just up the volume, Alison.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much and I can see that we're out of time. This is such an exciting volume, but just to speak for 1 second to Stephen's question about how does one translate crisis into the languages and worlds of children, and is this a word or concept that has any resonance for children? So in my honors work, which is part of the ethnographic fieldwork with children who've been poisoned by pesticides in Red Cross Hospital, that forms part of the chapter with Susan, I was actually exploring that word crisis and what that meant from different perspectives, because very clearly from a public health perspective, what a crisis that, you know, children are being poisoned by agricultural pesticides. Here were children's bodies, clearly systems in crisis, and yet that wasn't necessarily how the caregivers, particularly because I spent a lot of time speaking to primarily the mothers of children who were poisoned. It wasn't how they were speaking about these events. These events were narrated as part of a series of crises, and I'm using that word also because I was interested, and I assumed that this would that seeing, you know, the mothers of children who are really sick, that this would be the only difficult thing that they could speak about, and of course that's naive. These are people who are facing many difficult things, and I think the meaning of that word crisis does change depending on the sort of context that one is in. If this is something that's part of a painful everyday reality or a series of realities, then maybe it's not a crisis in the same way. But thank you very much for taking our chapter, and I'm really looking forward to reading the rest of the book.
Thanks, Alison. I think that wraps up time for our Q&A, so I'll hand back to Ifwa.
Oh, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Michelle, for stewarding us so expertly. Just quickly as a send-off and a note of thanks, I would love to be able to thank each of the contributors to this body of work, and I'm going to name them because I think it's important to do so. So I'd love to thank Kim Keating, my film partner, Susan Levine, for our many years of working together, Ali Eichmann, Rosemary Blake, Hannah Andrea Rother, Alison Schwartz, Gatlejo Tlabella, Naomi Marshak, Gatlejo Shoro, Kate Abney, Tony Stewart, Alicia Ernston, Stephen Pence, Mutsawashe Mutendi, and Nanaya Asante-Dako for all your work. It's been actually about 7 years now, 7 years in production, and it's seen so many reviewers, which is also leads me to my next thanks, which is to the publishers, African Sun Media. Thank you for trusting this process. Thank you for making the journey so effortless, really. The work of Michelle Mayer and Anina Hubert, who's in the background, has just been absolutely fantastic. The choice of the typesetting has everything to do with Anina, and I really appreciate it. The cover, the whole thing, African Sun Media, I cannot thank you enough. Also, a big thanks to Nina Callahan for, as Susan had mentioned earlier, such an early generous reading, and for contributing to the back of the book. There's a little contribution that she's written reflecting about what she thought of the book. I will always be grateful for the time and the effort amidst a very busy schedule. And then also a big thank you to the reviewers. Obviously they're not here, but the reviewers who from African Sun Media, it has actually seen, I think, 7 reviewers from different publishers, but the last 2 were from African Sun Media, and so a big thank you to them. They really sort of pushed us in to reinterrogate some really important questions that I think have manifested into this beautiful volume of work. Returning back to this launch, thank you so much, Michelle, and thank you so much, Ria, for holding our hands through this book launch. It couldn't have worked out as it has. It's been brilliant to have your thoughts and your eyes and your critical attention to some of these texts. I'm deeply grateful and honored. Thank you so much for seeing to the birth of this book. And also just lastly, thank you so much, Susan, through it all. Thank you for doing this with me. And I think, you know, the last time I'm haunted because the last time I did a production, I forgot to thank such a central character, and I'm really hoping that I haven't forgotten. If I have left somebody or some entity out, oh my gosh, I almost did. I have to thank the national, Mellon Foundation in Stellenbosch University's department, run by Professor Stephen Robbins and Professor Bernard Doubled. Thank you so much for extending your support and generosity, financial generosity, to seeing the book to fruition. Thank you very much for that, much appreciated. And also to all the contributors, I know I've thanked you in person, but I would just like to reiterate, your work is so, I salute you. It's great. I love it. I was so honored to have been gifted this book. So thank you so much.
Round of applause.
And yeah, thank you to the audience for staying with us and for listening and for sharing your questions. Without further, that's it, I think, on my end. Thank you very much, everyone.